When a man looked into the wreckage of a long-forgotten plane, he couldn't believe his eyes. But what did the overwhelmed observer see inside the plane? Why was the perfectly preserved plane in the middle of a deserted wasteland? And above all, what dramatic story does this silent witness tell? The crew of the B-17E Flying Fortress was doomed to die. On February 23, 1942, the crew of the heavy bomber found themselves in a dramatic situation, while the men around Captain Frederick Eaton were flying somewhere in the middle of nowhere over Papua New Guinea. The badly damaged aircraft slowly but surely gave up the ghost. However, the fact that the plane was in danger of crashing into an uninhabited area was not the only problem. Papua New Guinea was still in Japanese control, and therefore enemy hands at the time. As more and more fuel escaped from the Flying Fortress, the men faced a grim fate. Would they even survive a crash landing? Would they face an agonizing slow death in the endless wasteland? Or would they fall into the merciless hands of the Japanese? Well, surprisingly, fate answered all these depressing questions with neither. First, Captain Eaton managed to land the plane on what he thought was a large cornfield. But instead of flowering corn plants, a somewhat different welcoming committee awaited the men. A horde of wild crocodiles that had made themselves at home in the swamp where the plane had come to a crashing halt. However, the crew miraculously managed to survive the encounter with the dangerous armored lizards unscathed. What followed was an exhausting march into an uncertain future. 2 days passed before the soldiers had hacked their way through the razor-sharp kunai grass and reached dry land. Soon afterwards, the locals were astonished when the emaciated, mosquito-bitten group suddenly appeared on the scene. But the situation was even more serious. The survivors had contracted malaria. Fortunately, the group was taken to the nearest village by local residents, where they received medical care and food. A short time later, the crew traveled downstream in canoes and reached the hospital in Port Moresby on April 1st, 36 days after the crash. A week later, the men were already at war again. After the crash, Eaton was to fly 60 more missions, and whenever his orders took him over the crash site, he told the new crew members the story of the harrowing incident. And so the legend of the Swamp Ghost began. The recovery. A legend that was increasingly forgotten with the end of the Second World War. Over the following decades, hardly anyone talked about the crashed Swamp Ghost. This was not to change until 1972, when a group of Australian soldiers completed a routine flight. But while the men on board the helicopter were circling over the area, an unusual detail caught their eye. A detail that, on closer inspection, turned out to be the Flying Fortress from back then. After the soldiers approached the wreckage and took a look inside, they could not believe their eyes. Not only was the aircraft still in surprisingly good condition after all those years in the swamp, no, the equipment also looked as if it had only been stowed away a few moments ago. While the machine guns were still in place, even the coffee thermos flasks were intact. News of the rediscovery subsequently spread like wildfire, not least due to the Swamp Ghost pictures that Charles Darby included in his book, Pacific Aircraft Wrecks. As the enthusiasm for the recovery of the aircraft from the Second World War really took off, more and more people made their way to the site. There, they began to dismantle the aircraft to take the parts home as souvenirs or to sell. But despite the cannibalization, the basic aircraft structure remained remarkably intact. That is, until the Flying Fortress was finally pulled out of the swamp, of course. Alfred Hagen, a pilot and contractor from Pennsylvania, had his eye on the Swamp Ghost in November 2005. He wanted to free the bomber from Meyer and bring it to the United States. No sooner said than done. A few months after the payment of $100,000 later, the B-17 was dismantled into its individual parts for transportation to the USA. However, the wait for approval for the transfer turned into a real test of patience. The wreck was only given the green light for its journey in February 2010. On June 11th of the same year, the plane was finally presented to the public. Among the onlookers who had gathered in Long Beach, California at the time were some family members of the original crew. Subsequent plans called for the winged Swamp Ghost to be restored and put on permanent display. After a loan to the Planes of Fame Air Museum at Chino Airport, the plane was received by the Pacific Aviation Museum in Pearl Harbor in 2013. There, it still tells the story of some daring soldiers who narrowly escaped death. The Forgotten World. Time and again, we hear about spectacular archaeological discoveries. Well, sometimes these are ancient royal tombs, and sometimes even full-blown ruined cities. Researchers in China tracked down something you've definitely never heard of. The experts stumbled upon a forgotten world. But what does that mean? In the south of the country, the experts identified an unusually large and deep sinkhole. Also known as a sinkhole, this refers to characteristic depressions in crust areas, which usually have a round or elliptical shape. These formations are created when water penetrates the rock through cracks, where it erodes tunnels that form chambers over time. As soon as these cavities are large enough, they collapse and leave gaping holes in the ground. What makes this Chinese sinkhole so special is the fact that it is probably home to unique flora and fauna that is drastically different from anything we know. This is because the sinkhole contains its own pristine ecosystem that still shines with primeval splendor. While the hidden world is located in the Guangxi Shuang Autonomous Region, this area is known for its breathtaking stalactite caves, its rivers, and its towering karst formations that resemble stone fangs. But it is also thanks to the countless sinkholes that the region can call itself an official UNESCO World Heritage Site. The newly discovered sinkhole is a good 190 meters deep, over 300 meters long, and 150 meters wide. While most objects of this kind are usually filled with water, the Chinese researchers discovered ancient trees 40 meters high. Even the dense overgrowth on the ground reaches up to a grown man's shoulder. The area seems so bizarre and strange to the experts that they would not be surprised if endemic species exist here that have never been scientifically described. Gigantic rainforest metropolises. For a long time, historians assumed that the pre-Columbian inhabitants of the Amazon basin only lived in small, loose groups and gave the jungle a wide berth. Well, you can be so wrong. A new laser technology revealed that the South American natives were in fact creating full-blown metropolises with millions that past explorers would never have dared to dream of. While men like Percy Fawcett had no choice but to venture into the dangerous turmoil of the rainforest themselves, modern-day explorers find themselves in a far more comfortable situation. The laser-based technology LiDAR makes it possible to digitally clear the jungle and then take a look at the secrets slumbering beneath the impenetrable sea of leaves. The sensational discovery made in this way in Guatemala gives us a glimpse of the overwhelming things that will come to light in the future. The researchers here identify the ruins of more than 60,000 buildings. In addition to ordinary dwellings, these include magnificent palaces that have lurked in secret for centuries. While the newly discovered sites are attributed to the legendary Maya civilization, the finds show that we have massively underestimated their complexity, scale, and population density in the past. In addition to the buildings mentioned above, the Maya also built complex elevated roads that connected the urban centers and the quarries. Furthermore, an ingenious irrigation and terrace system ensued that the population was supplied with water. In this way, the inhabitants were able to cultivate crops all year round and satisfy the hunger of the workers, who significantly reshaped the landscape. Considering that this mysterious culture used neither the wheel nor pack animals, the jungle metropolises appear even more impressive. While the number of Maya was previously estimated at a maximum of 5 million, researchers now believe that it was 3 times that number. What's more, the mass of people lived in low-lying swampy regions, and therefore in areas that were once considered uninhabitable. This is why the blossoming of a complex civilization in the tropics was once considered unimaginable. However, the LiDAR data now suggests that the tropics were actually the starting point from which societies developed and spread. The elevated wide causeways of the Maya show that these not only served as connecting routes, but also for trade and other forms of exchange. However, the experts were particularly astounded when they discovered military infrastructure at every turn. The jungle metropolises were teeming with ramparts, fortresses, and defensive walls. These ruins testify to the fact that war was omnipresent back then. But what is revolutionary and exciting for the experts is old hat for the looters. The LiDAR images also revealed thousands of pits from the modern era, which were apparently created by raiders. The increasing destruction of the environment is also a big problem. Guatemala loses 10% of its forests every year. As nature has to make way for agriculture or settlement, We do not know what archaeological treasures will be lost forever. Subscribe and never miss an exciting video again.